Most readers think Les Misérables is a novel about revolution. That may be the biggest mistake you can make when reading it. Because if you strip away the barricades, the political arguments, the social unrest, and all the grand historical machinery surrounding the story, something strange remains. Something far quieter. And perhaps far more powerful. What if Les Misérables is not actually driven by revolution at all? What if it is driven by love? Not the kind of love that usually gets remembered. Not the kind celebrated in songs, weddings, or happy endings. I'm talking about a different force entirely, the kind of love that leaves no monument behind. The kind that changes lives and then disappears from the record. And once you begin looking for it, an unsettling pattern starts to emerge. Think about how history works. We remember generals. We remember presidents. We remember movements, wars, victories, and defeats. We remember the people standing on the stage. But how often do we remember the person standing just outside the spotlight, the one whose choice made everything else possible? Les Misérables seems obsessed with that question. In fact, some of the most important forces in the novel are almost invisible. They are not always the loudest voices. They are not always the people with authority. Sometimes they are barely noticed at all. And that creates a fascinating contradiction. The characters who appear to possess power often struggle to transform the world around them. Meanwhile, others who seem powerless leave consequences that echo through multiple lives. Why? Why would Victor Hugo build a story this way? And more importantly, why do so many readers miss it? Here's where the mystery deepens. Imagine two silver candlesticks sitting quietly in a room. On the surface, they are just objects. But what if they are something else? What if they represent a transfer of possibility from one human being to another? What if a simple act of compassion can create consequences that travel farther than laws, institutions, or even revolutions? That idea sounds sentimental at first. Until you realize that Les Misérables repeatedly asks the same unsettling question from different angles. Can a single act of human kindness alter the course of a life? And if one life changes, what happens to every life connected to it? Suddenly, the story becomes much larger than a historical drama. Now we're talking about networks of influence. Invisible chains of cause and effect. Emotional decisions that ripple outward for years. A gesture. A sacrifice. A choice made with no expectation of reward. Then another. And another. Until an entire world begins moving in a different direction. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe that the novel's true engine is politics alone. Because politics explains systems. Love explains people. And people are what ultimately shape destiny. This is where most readers encounter a blind spot. They notice the visible events. They remember the public conflicts. They focus on the people history chooses to celebrate. But Les Misérables keeps pulling our attention elsewhere, toward forgotten sacrifices, unseen loyalties, and quiet acts of devotion that rarely receive recognition. Which raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe the most important character in a story is not the one everyone remembers. Maybe the most important act is the one almost nobody sees. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery hidden inside Les Misérables is not who fought, who won, or who lost. It is this: which act of love changed everything? Before we can identify the hidden act of love that may change everything, we have to confront a deeper problem. We have to ask whether we're even looking in the right place. Because most readers approach stories the same way they approach history. They look for the people at the center. The visible figures. The names that dominate the conversation. But what if influence and visibility are not the same thing? What if the people who receive the most attention are not the people creating the most consequences? That possibility sits quietly beneath the entire moral architecture of this novel. Think about the difference between a spark and a fire. When we see a fire, our eyes are drawn to the flames. They're dramatic. They're impossible to ignore. But the spark that started everything is usually forgotten. In fact, once the fire grows large enough, most people stop asking where it began. Les Miserables repeatedly challenges that instinct. Not by telling us that public events are unimportant, but by suggesting that public events are often downstream from private choices. And that shifts the conflict into a completely different dimension. The real battle is no longer between revolution and order. It's between recognition and invisibility. Between the people history remembers and the people history uses. That's why some of the most fascinating figures in the novel operate from the shadows. They don't control institutions. They don't command armies. They don't write laws. Yet their decisions create consequences that travel farther than the actions of people with far greater authority. And here we encounter another contradiction. Modern culture often teaches us that influence comes from power. More status. More attention. More followers. More control. But Hugo seems to be exploring the opposite idea. He keeps returning to individuals who possess almost none of those things. Individuals whose greatest strength is not power, but willingness. Willingness to give. Willingness to protect. Willingness to sacrifice. Even when no reward is waiting on the other side. That distinction matters because sacrifice and transaction are not the same thing. A transaction expects something back. A sacrifice accepts the possibility of being forgotten. And once you recognize that pattern, a new question begins to emerge. What if the novel's deepest form of love is not romantic at all? What if it is the decision to place another person's future above your own importance? Suddenly, one of the recurring images in the story starts to feel different. Not the barricade. Not the courtroom. Not the streets. A much quieter image. A future handed from one person to another. A life protected. A burden carried. A chance preserved. The image is almost invisible because it doesn't announce itself. Like those silver candlesticks we mentioned earlier, its power comes from what it represents rather than what it is. A transfer. A continuation. A chain reaction. One human being refusing to let another disappear. And that chain reaction creates a consequence far larger than any single relationship. At first, it changes a life. Then it changes multiple lives. Then it begins shaping an entire moral universe. This is where the scale of the mystery expands. Because if acts of compassion generate consequences that ripple outward for years, then every forgotten sacrifice becomes a hidden force inside the story. Every unseen act becomes a possible turning point. Every overlooked character becomes a potential architect of destiny. Which leads us to an uncomfortable realization. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking which character receives the most attention, maybe we should be asking which character leaves the largest invisible footprint. Because somewhere beneath the public story, beneath the political story, and beneath the story most readers think they know, there appears to be another narrative taking shape. A narrative built from sacrifices that vanish from memory while their consequences remain. And if that's true, then we're getting closer to the central mystery. Not who loved. Not who suffered. Not even who changed. But which unseen sacrifice continues to move the entire story long after the person who made it has disappeared from view. If invisible sacrifices shape the story more than visible victories, then we run into a problem that is much harder to solve. Why are those sacrifices invisible in the first place? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Human beings naturally notice dramatic events. We remember speeches more easily than silence. We remember battles more easily than loyalty. We remember moments of triumph more easily than years of devotion. But the deeper you look, the less satisfying that explanation becomes. Because Les Miserables does not merely contain forgotten sacrifices. It appears to be structured around them. That distinction changes everything. A forgotten sacrifice is a tragic detail. A world built on forgotten sacrifices is a philosophy. And this is where the novel begins to challenge one of our most comfortable assumptions. We like to believe that goodness is eventually rewarded. With recognition. That contribution leads to credit. That influence leads to visibility. That history, in the long run, gets the story right. But what if it does not? What if some of the most important contributions become invisible precisely because they succeed? Think about a bridge. Nobody drives across a bridge thinking about the engineers who designed it decades earlier. Their success creates invisibility. The better the bridge works, the less anyone notices it. The same paradox seems to appear throughout the moral universe of this story. The people who protect futures often disappear from those futures. The people who create possibilities are frequently absent when those possibilities arrive. The people who carry the heaviest burdens are often forgotten once the burden is gone. That is not merely sad. It is unsettling. Because it forces us to reconsider how influence actually works. Take the archetype of the guardian. Not the conqueror. Not the revolutionary. The guardian. The person whose role is not to stand at the center of history, but to ensure someone else reaches it. The guardian's influence is enormous, yet strangely difficult to measure. Their greatest achievement is often becoming unnecessary. Their reward is often absence. Their legacy is often transferred into another life. And that creates a contradiction that modern culture struggles to understand. We celebrate visibility. The novel repeatedly celebrates responsibility. We celebrate achievement. The novel repeatedly asks who made achievement possible. We celebrate outcomes. The novel keeps pulling our attention toward causes. And suddenly the mystery expands beyond individual characters. Now we are looking at an entire civilization. Because every society tells stories about who matters. Every culture creates heroes. Every generation decides whose names survive. But what happens when a culture becomes incapable of recognizing its invisible guardians? What happens when sacrifice loses value because it cannot be measured? What happens when recognition becomes more important than contribution? Now the question is no longer literary. Now it becomes social. Even philosophical. Perhaps that is why certain images linger long after the details fade. A pair of silver candlesticks. A promise carried forward. A life protected at great personal cost. A figure standing in the shadows while someone else steps into the light. These images function almost like fingerprints left behind by an unseen force. They keep pointing toward the same possibility. That love, in this story, is not primarily an emotion. It is an act of stewardship. A decision to preserve another person's future. Even when history will never know your name. And yet there is still something that does not fit. Something the novel refuses to explain immediately. Because not all sacrifices carry the same weight. Not all acts of love generate the same consequences. Some disappear quietly. Others alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Which means there may be a hierarchy hidden beneath the story. A chain of invisible influences. A sequence of sacrifices whose effects continue expanding long after the original act is forgotten. And if that is true, then we have reached an even deeper mystery. Among all the acts of compassion woven into this world, which one becomes the first domino? Which sacrifice transforms from a private decision into a force powerful enough to reshape destinies, identities, and generations that follow? Because somewhere in that answer, the true architecture of the story may finally begin to reveal itself. What if we have been searching for the wrong kind of love altogether? Up to this point, the evidence has been pointing towards sacrifice, influence, and invisible consequences. But now a more surprising revelation begins to emerge. The deepest form of love in this story is not defined by possession. It is defined by release. That sounds counterintuitive because most narratives teach us to associate love with attachment. Holding on. Protecting what belongs to us. Securing a desired future. Yet the moral logic operating beneath this world seems to follow a different rule. The characters who leave the strongest legacy are often the ones willing to surrender control over the very thing they care about most. This is where the hidden architecture of the story starts to reveal itself. Not as a chain of emotional relationships, but as a chain of transfers. One person carrying another. One generation preserving the next. One future handed forward like a fragile flame. Suddenly, a recurring image takes on a new meaning. Not a battlefield. Not a courtroom. Not a political symbol. A small light passed from one set of hands to another. A future entrusted rather than owned. A possibility protected rather than possessed. That image functions almost like the spiritual blueprint of the entire novel. Because the real question is no longer who loved whom. The real question becomes, who was willing to give up something valuable so that another person could become who they were meant to be? And that shift changes the role of nearly every important figure. The guardian is no longer simply a protector. The guardian becomes a bridge between past suffering and future possibility. The invisible lover is no longer merely tragic. The invisible lover becomes a force that redirects destiny without receiving recognition. The moral guide is no longer simply kind. The moral guide becomes the origin point of a chain reaction whose consequences extend far beyond the original act. What makes this revelation powerful is that it exposes a contradiction at the heart of modern thinking. We often measure influence through visibility. The story measures influence through transmission. We ask who stood at the center. The story asks who made the center possible. We celebrate achievement. The story investigates inheritance. Not financial inheritance. Moral inheritance. Emotional inheritance. Human inheritance. The passing forward of courage, compassion, responsibility, and hope. This creates consequences far larger than individual lives. Because civilizations themselves are built on transfers that are rarely acknowledged. Every generation inherits institutions it did not create. Values it did not invent. Sacrifices it did not witness. The deeper message hidden beneath the narrative may be that society survives because countless acts of stewardship disappear into the future. Their creators vanish. Their consequences remain. This is why some memory fragments linger with unusual force. A pair of silver candlesticks. A life spared from darkness. A burden carried in silence. A future protected by someone who will never be fully remembered. These are not merely symbols inside a story. They are symbols of a philosophy. A philosophy suggesting that the most powerful form of love is not acquisition. It is transmission. Not ownership. Stewardship. Not being remembered. Ensuring that someone else has a chance to be remembered. Yet even this revelation leaves one crucial mystery unresolved. If the entire moral universe operates through chains of transmission, then somewhere there must be a single moment where the chain truly begins. A first transfer. A first act. A first decision so consequential that every sacrifice that follows can be traced back to it. And when we finally identify that moment, we may discover that the hidden center of the story was never where most readers were looking at all. So what is the first transfer? What is the hidden center from which all these consequences begin to radiate? The answer is more radical than most readers realize. The deepest love story in this novel is not a romance between two people. It is the story of compassion itself moving from one human being to another, transforming identity as it travels. That is the revelation hidden beneath the visible narrative. The novel is not ultimately asking whether love can survive hardship. It is asking whether compassion can reproduce itself. Whether one act of grace can create another. Whether mercy can become inheritance. Once that possibility comes into focus, the entire structure suddenly aligns. The most important relationships are not defined by desire. They are defined by transmission. A moral gift passed forward. A future rescued. A burden accepted so that someone else does not have to carry it. This is why the role of the guardian becomes so important. The guardian is not merely protecting a person. The guardian is preserving the continuation of compassion itself. The guardian becomes a living bridge between suffering and hope. And this is also why certain characters exert influence far beyond their apparent position in the story. Their power does not come from authority. It comes from becoming carriers of a moral force larger than themselves. Here we encounter the deepest contradiction in the entire work. Modern thinking often assumes that change happens through systems, through institutions, through policies, through structures. The novel does not reject those things, but it quietly proposes something more fundamental. Systems may shape behavior, but compassion shapes identity. And identity shapes destiny. That is why a single moral decision can generate consequences that no political movement can fully predict. Imagine a pair of silver candlesticks standing on a table. Not as objects, as symbols. They represent something extraordinary, proof that a human being can be seen differently than they see themselves. That may be the most transformative gift one person can offer another. Not money. Not power. Not status. A new vision of who they can become. Once that gift is accepted, an invisible chain reaction begins. One life changes. Then another. Then another. The consequences spread outward across families, generations, and communities. What appears to be an individual act becomes a social force. What appears to be private becomes historical. What appears to be small becomes civilization scale. This is the insight many readers overlook because they focus on visible conflict. The true engine of the story is not conflict. Conflict creates pressure. Compassion creates direction. Conflict reveals character. Compassion transforms character. Conflict explains why people suffer. Compassion explains why they continue. Suddenly the hidden love story beneath the novel becomes visible. It is not centered on possession. It is not centered on recognition. It is not even centered on reciprocity. It is centered on the mysterious ability of one human being to carry hope into another person's future. A future they may never see. A future that may never remember them. That is why the invisible lover, the silent guardian, and the forgotten benefactor all belong to the same symbolic family. They represent a form of love that accepts disappearance. A form of love willing to vanish so that something larger can survive. And that realization carries an uncomfortable consequence. If the most powerful force in the story is not revolution, law, or ambition, but transmitted compassion, then perhaps the true measure of a life is not what we achieve. Perhaps it is what continues because we were here. And if that is true, then an even larger question emerges. What happens to a society when the chain of compassion breaks? What becomes of a civilization that remembers achievement but forgets transmission, remembers heroes but forgets guardians, remembers outcomes but forgets the quiet acts that made those outcomes possible? If compassion is the force that travels through the story, then the next question is unavoidable. What does that force leave behind? What is the consequence of building a world on invisible acts rather than visible victories? The answer is both inspiring and unsettling. Because the legacy of compassion is not certainty. It is vulnerability. Every act of stewardship creates the possibility of renewal, but it also creates risk. The person who passes hope forward can never fully control what happens next. The guardian cannot guarantee the future. The benefactor cannot dictate the outcome. The invisible lover cannot determine how their sacrifice will be remembered. Once the gift is given, it enters a world beyond their authority. That is the price of transmission. And that price reveals something profound about the human condition. We often imagine legacy as a monument. Something permanent. Something visible. Something attached to our name. Yet the deeper legacy presented here looks very different. It resembles a seed rather than a statue. A seed disappears into the ground. It becomes difficult to see. Difficult to measure. Sometimes impossible to trace. Yet years later, an entire forest may exist because of it. This is why the story's most enduring figures are not defined by what they possess. They are defined by what they release into the future. Their influence survives because it escapes ownership. Their contribution survives because it becomes part of someone else's life. Consider the emotional consequence of that idea. It means the most important outcomes are often invisible to the People who create them. A child grows because someone protected them. A future emerges because someone carried a burden. A moral awakening becomes possible because someone chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. Yet the original act may fade from memory entirely. This creates one of the most difficult paradoxes in the story. The greater the success of an invisible sacrifice, the less visible the sacrifice itself becomes. And that paradox extends far beyond literature. Entire societies depend upon contributions that receive little recognition. Parents whose names disappear from public memory. Teachers whose influence cannot be measured. Caregivers whose efforts leave no monument. People who quietly transfer stability, wisdom, courage, and hope into the lives of others. Civilization rests upon these hidden foundations more than it likes to admit. This is where the scale shifts again. We are no longer discussing individual characters. We are discussing a pattern of human existence. A pattern in which the most important forces are often the hardest to see. A pair of silver candlesticks. A future protected. A burden carried in silence. A life redirected by an act that appears small at the moment it occurs. These memory fragments endure because they reveal something true about reality itself. Human beings are shaped not only by the events they experience, but by the unseen generosity embedded within those events. And yet there is a cost. Every chain of compassion remains fragile. Every transmission depends upon someone choosing to continue it. Nothing guarantees that the gift will be passed forward. Nothing guarantees that memory will survive. Nothing guarantees that gratitude will exist. Which means the ultimate legacy is never secure. It must be renewed again and again by people who may never meet one another. That realization leaves us with a final consequence. The survival of hope may depend less on extraordinary heroes than on ordinary acts repeated across generations. But if that is true, then a troubling mystery remains unresolved. When a society begins to forget its invisible guardians, when recognition becomes more valuable than responsibility, and when transmission gives way to self-interest, how long can the chain continue before it finally breaks? Perhaps that is why this story continues to endure long after its historical setting has faded into the distance. Not because it provides answers, but because it quietly changes the questions we ask. At the beginning, it is tempting to look for dramatic forces. Power. Conflict. Social upheaval. The movements that seem large enough to shape the world. But by the end, something else remains in the mind. Not a victory. Not a system. Not even a hero in the conventional sense. What remains are fragments. A pair of silver candlesticks catching the light. A burden carried without recognition. A future protected by someone who will never fully share in it. A life changed because another person chose compassion when no one required it of them. These images linger because they point toward a truth that extends far beyond any single novel. Human beings rarely inherit the world directly. We inherit the consequences of one another. We inherit sacrifices we never witnessed. Acts of courage we never thanked. Decisions made by people whose names we no longer know. The deeper meaning is not that compassion always wins. The deeper meaning is that compassion continues. It moves through time in ways that are almost impossible to measure. It survives not because it is powerful in the traditional sense, but because it is transferable. One person receives it. Another person carries it forward. Another person transforms it into something new. And somewhere along the way, the original source disappears from view. There is something both beautiful and humbling about that realization. It challenges one of the strongest desires in human nature, the desire to be remembered. The story suggests that significance and recognition are not the same thing. A person may leave an enormous imprint on the future without leaving an enormous imprint on history. In fact, the two may sometimes move in opposite directions. The figures who matter most are not always the figures who receive the most attention. The forces that sustain a society are not always the forces that dominate its headlines. The values that shape a life are often transmitted quietly, almost invisibly, through relationships, examples, and acts of stewardship that seem small in the moment they occur. That is why the story still feels modern. We live in a world obsessed with visibility. A world that measures impact through numbers, attention, and public recognition. Yet the questions raised here belong to a deeper layer of human experience. Who carried us when we could not carry ourselves? Who protected possibilities that we later took for granted? What unseen generosity exists beneath the lives we live today? And perhaps the most important question of all is not about the people inside the story. It is about us. Because sooner or later, every human being becomes part of the same chain. We all inherit something. We all pass something forward. We all leave behind consequences that extend beyond what we can see. The real mystery is not whether compassion changes the world. The real mystery is how often it does so without being noticed. And maybe that is the final lesson hidden beneath everything else. The most important acts in a human life may not be the ones that make us visible. They may be the ones that make a future possible for someone we will never meet. And if that is true, then when history looks back on any of us, perhaps the question that matters most will not be what we achieved, but what continued to exist because we were here.